London, August 1305. The sky hangs heavy over Smithfield, the stench of rot seeping through the narrow alleys, where dogs gnaw at bone and barefoot children whisper about monsters. But the monster they speak of today is no fairy tale. He is chained, bloodied, and dragged through the streets as if his very existence were treason. William Wallace. A name the nobles now spit with revulsion. A name that once made armies tremble, but look at him now, naked, half dead, lashed to a wooden hurdle. They have tied his ankles so tight his skin splits, and still he does not scream. He sees the crowds, merchants, soldiers, beggars, gathered not to mourn, but to witness, to celebrate the death of the man they once called hero. They will not give him a clean execution. No, the crown demands spectacle. His flesh will be peeled, his genitals torn away, his bowels burned while he still breathes, his heart held aloft as if his courage were a sin. And yet, beneath the gore and chains, beneath the myth they hope to butcher, there remains a man. Not a symbol, not Braveheart, a human being who dared to defy a crown and who will now pay in pieces. Today, we strip away the legend and witness the horror they made of him. There is no roar of war in the beginning, no clang of swords, only wind. A cold, narrow wind curling through the heather, brushing the side of a small stone house where a boy once pressed his face to the wooden slats of the window, watching the horizon for men who would never return. The silence of the dead hung heavier than mourning. It was the kind of grief that didn't wail. It sat quiet in the marrow. William Wallace was not born to legend. He was born to absence, his father's. Hands had once held a plow. His brother's laughter once echoed near the riverbank, where the reeds grew long and unbothered. But both were swallowed by the crown's appetite, vanished in a distant skirmish, nameless among the rested dead. William watched his mother age before her time, her eyes fixed to the floor as though all joy had sunk into it. He learned early that memory was dangerous, that names could be punishable, that love, if spoken too loud, could be ripped away like a banner in wind, so he kept his grief quiet, and his mind sharp, Latin, French, Scripture. He learned to read the world the way a starving man learns to read the forest, slowly, with a guarded reverence. He was taught not only letters, but control. The monks showed him how to bend thought, like iron, how to carry silence like a blade, but grief seeped through him anyway. At night, the wind didn't sound like wind. It sounded like his brother's scream, swallowed in fog. It sounded like boots on earth. It sounded like betrayal. He never spoke of revenge, not because he didn't feel it, but because he knew its name too well. Injustice had many faces, and all of them wore robes. All of them held titles, and none of them would remember a boy whose family had been reduced to a whisper. He grew into a tall, quiet man, eyes too alert, voice too still. He did not crave power. He did not seek blood, but he carried a silence that made people look twice. As if something inside him had been sharpened too young, he walked through villages where the air smelled of burnt bread and obedience, where English guards rode with dead eyes and casual cruelty. He passed walls carved with laws he had never agreed to. He bowed when expected. He listened when insulted. And when he clenched his fists, he did so behind his back. He was not yet a legend. He was not yet a warrior. He was just a man, but there are silences that can split mountains. There are griefs that do not fade, only settle deeper. And some names, though erased from record, write themselves into the skin. His was not born in triumph. It was born in loss and in the stillness of that early life. With dirt under his nails and shadows in his lungs, the myth began to rot away. What remained was colder, realer, a human shaped not by destiny, but by what had been taken from him, and taken again, and taken again, until something within him stopped yielding. It began with a silence too orderly to be natural, not the silence of peace, but of something stifled, a world holding its breath beneath foreign boots. In the towns, the air was colder. The wind had changed its sound. It no longer moved freely through the trees. It slithered instead between the corners of law parchments nailed to doors. Between English accents spoken like verdicts, there were no fires unless permitted, no feasts unless taxed. The bells rang on someone else's schedule. The men who came were not invaders with wild hair and shrieking mouths. They were measured, groomed, robed, and they brought not just weapons, but ink, seals, languages that wrapped around the throat like velvet nooses. They smiled with teeth too clean, spoke of order and obedience, and wore the king's lion as if it had been born into them. In the churches, Latin was twisted into threat. In the courts, land was carved from men's hands with words they couldn't read. Sons watched their fathers bow, not to God, but to titles foreign to their blood. It was not conquest. It was replacement. The old names began to vanish, not through fire, but through forgetting. Borders weren't redrawn, they were rewritten. And every signature cost something. A piece of soil, a stone wall, a name passed down that no longer passed muster. The air tasted different. Not of battle smoke, but of parchment dust and neat, salted by another man's law. What had once been loud, festivals, births, arguments in the street, became subdued. The quiet of surveillance, the hush of knowing that English eyes were always near, and English gold could make a neighbor kneel. Even the hills felt watched. Beneath every transaction, every marriage, every harvest, was the dull throb of humiliation. The kind that wears a man down not with lashes, but with a long, invisible erosion. You did not need a sword to conquer a people. You only had to make them repeat your words, pay your tolls, eat their bread with your hand hovering above their plate. Wallace grew within this suffocation. He watched the toll collectors pass, draped in crimson, inspecting every sack of barley like it had betrayed a king. He watched the magistrates recite laws as though they were absolutions, unmoved by the children coughing in cold homes, the widows whose lands had been absorbed into someone else's domain. The hunger in the villages was not just for food, but for a name that had not been defiled. Men who once held their heads high now looked at the ground when English riders passed, and when Wallace looked at those riders, he did not see authority. He saw erasure. He saw his brother's silence repeated in every bowed back, every unclenched fist, every small compliance that stitched a people into permanent submission. The cruelty of it was not loud. It was efficient. Paper over pain, ceremony over corpse. The crown had learned to press its boot not on the neck, but on the soul, slow enough that most did not notice they could no longer breathe. The Scottish voice, once wild and unashamed, became something whispered behind doors. Mothers taught their sons to be silent before they could walk. The land had not been burned, but it had been quieted, and that quiet bred a new kind of rage, not the kind that stormed castles, the kind that waited, that learned, that studied the shape of control until it could carve through it with something deeper than steel. A rage that did not shout, a rage that remembered, because one day, even the smoothest chains crack, even obedience has its limit, and even silence, when stretched long enough, begins to scream. The rope marks were still fresh on her neck when they dragged her through the mud. She had not begged. That was what made them angry. She had not looked afraid, even as their fists broke bone. Her name was whispered among women who knew what it meant to speak softly in the presence of soldiers. She was not a soldier. She was not a rebel. She was a wife. And in the eyes of her killers, that was defiance enough. They hung her not because she was dangerous, but because she mattered to someone who would not kneel. The dirt around her grave stayed wet for days. William knelt at it alone, his hands motionless in the frozen soil. No prayers, no tears, just the stillness of a man who had carried grief his whole life and had finally been given permission to stop hiding it. They thought the rope would tame him. They thought the body would end him. But some men are not broken by cruelty. They are released by it. The next morning, the wind shifted. It carried smoke, but not from a hearth. From an outpost, timber turned to cinder, guards with split throats. No declaration, no symbol, just a fire that should not have burned. They found the captain's eyes removed. They found his tongue nailed to the gate. There were no survivors. In the weeks that followed, it spread like a fever. The silence that had cloaked the hills for so long began to tear. One patrol vanished, then another. English roads became haunted. Names once whispered now passed between mouths with steel behind them. Farmers carried blades in their carts. Priests stopped offering blessings to men in red, and always, somewhere just out of reach, the same man appeared, quiet, fast, brutal. He did not wear a crown or claim a title. He left no speech behind. But where he passed, English arrogance turned. To Ashdod, he did not raise a flag. He raised fear. They began to speak of him not as a man, but as a reckoning, the one they failed to break, the one who would not forget. The forests seemed to favor him, the rivers to guard him. He moved with the grief of a widower and the patience of the betrayed. He did not forgive. He did not explain. He simply struck, and yet, beneath the fury, the wound never closed. He still dreamt of her hands, rough from work, gentle in silence, her laughter in the dark, her presence beside him in a world that had allowed one small happiness. They took that from him. They took her knowing it would hollow him, but they had misread him. It did not hollow. It lit, a fire fed by memory, stoked by humiliation. He did not want glory. He wanted justice so old and so cold it could not be reasoned with. The rebellion did not begin with a banner. It began with a body, not on a battlefield, but on a noose. And for every heartbeat that failed inside her chest, something ancient woke inside his. They killed a woman to tame a man. Instead, they created something they could no longer name, something that would not ask, would not warn, would not stop. The snow did not fall like a blessing. It fell like ash, dry, indifferent, quiet. It clung to Wallace's cloak and hair, melting slower than it should have. The ground beneath him was still dark with blood from the last men who called him. Mad, he had not asked for their challenge, but they had drawn swords with noble crests, and he had answered with silence and fire. The nobles watched from stone halls, their boots polished, their hands soft with power. They drank wine while he bled in the cold. They carved alliances with ink, while he carved paths through enemies with his bare hands. They admired his victories, but never stood beside him. They asked him to swear, not to a flag, not to a god, but to them, the lords with shifting loyalties and conditional oaths. They offered him titles, command, legitimacy. He refused. He would not be their weapon. He would not kneel before men who had watched his country rot for the sake of comfort. He would not trade one crown for another. There was no court behind his. Justice, only memory. Only her name, still burning in his chest. Only the unburied dead, their mouths frozen mid-prayer. He fought for what had no seal, no parchment, no throne. He fought for something older than allegiance, dignity that made him dangerous. The nobles whispered. They feared him not for his sword, but for his purity, his refusal to bargain, his cold, unbending line, because power could not hold him. And men who cannot be bought are always next to be broken. He began to notice absences. support that vanished at the edge of the forest, promises that dissolved when the arrows flew, allies who watched from a distance, waiting to see if he would fail first. They needed him visible. They did not want him victorious. He did not ask for company. But still, the cold deepened. Men he once called brother began to delay letters. Resources dried. Silence grew like mold on the walls of his trust. No dagger in his back, just the slow, deliberate turning of faces. The kind of betrayal that does not wound the flesh, only hollows the soul. Still, he fought because justice does not need applause, because some wounds demand voice, and because the ones who cannot be saved still deserve a name spoken aloud. He knew the end was coming, not from the enemy's charge, but from within, from the rot that eats through loyalty when ambition becomes louder than grief. He moved like a shadow now, spoke less, slept less. There were fewer allies, fewer fires, more doubt, and the kind of loneliness that crept beneath the ribs. He was becoming a symbol, and symbols are often stripped of their skin before anyone remembers the man inside. But still, he would not kneel. He would not forget. And when the quiet returned after every ambush, every skirmish, every betrayal, he would still hear her name, still feel her warmth, still carry the promise that no lord could command. But in that silence, he also heard something else. The breath of fate tightening, the final stillness, approaching not from an enemy, but from the place where belief dies, abandoned by those who once called it noble. The ale was stale, the fire too small, the men too polite. Something in the room sat wrong in the air, like meat that had just begun to rot, invisible but unmistakable. Wallace noticed it, the way animals notice storms, not in words, but in the tightening of the chest. In the quiet way, the bartender avoided his eyes. In the stillness that wasn't natural, he had not come to hide. He had come to speak, to gather, to mend. His face was thinner than before, his voice more brittle, but his presence still carried weight, enough to bend the air when he entered. A room, but on this night, the air did not bend. It stiffened. The man across the table wore Scottish colors. His name was not important. What mattered was how slowly he spoke, how often he smiled, as if the silence between words was meant to mask something sharper. Wallace drank little, ate nothing. But he stayed, out of duty, out of fatigue, out of a belief that some part of his country had not yet been sold. He was wrong when they came for him. It was not with shouting or swords. It was with gloves, with letters, with a calm voice saying, his name as though it belonged to the crown. No resistance, no chaos, just the slow, precise movement of betrayal completing its task. They bound his hands in rope, not iron. That was the insult. The suggestion that he would not struggle, that he had already been defeated, not on the battlefield, but in a room with low ceilings and warm wine. The betrayal was not loud. It was clinical. There were no English banners, no redcoats, just a Scot leading him out into the cold. A fellow, countryman, eyes low, hands steady, paid in coin and the promise of proximity to power. They did not exchange words. There was nothing left to say. Wallace's silence in that moment was not confusion. It was realization that the knife was not in his back, but in his blood. The journey from the tavern to the prison passed through narrow alleys. The stones beneath his boots were slick, not with rain, with something older, something that clung. He did not stumble. He walked like a man who had always expected it would end this way, not with the clash of armies, but with a handshake. Inside the cell, the air was wet. The walls seeped, rats moved without fear. It was not the filth that stung him. It was the quiet, the echo of every man who had looked him in the eye and said, "We stand with you." He sat, not as a prisoner, as an ending, But somewhere, far away, in a place he would never see again, the wind moved through the grass. It remembered his name. The soil had not betrayed him. The trees had not lied. Only men had, and men forget what they owe the ones who refuse to kneel. The hall did not echo. Its walls were too thick. The cold was not the kind that made men shiver. It was the kind that preserved corpses. Westminster reeked of oil and hierarchy, of stone cut to make men feel small. And in its center, beneath, the gaze of powdered wigs and waxy stares, they placed him like an animal meant to entertain. Not a defendant, a symbol. Something already condemned. He had no counsel, no parchment, no voice that was not immediately struck down. His crimes were listed in a language soaked with ceremony. High treason, rebellion, war against the crown. Each word heavier than the last, not because of truth, but because of how confidently they were spoken. He listened without moving. His wrists were bruised. His ankles ached, but it was not the pain that twisted in his stomach. It was the lie. They called him a traitor. A traitor to what? He had never sworn an oath to Edward, never bent the knee, never raised a cup in the name of that lion-draped tyrant. His loyalty had been to his own dead, to the soil, to the sound of her voice in the morning light. And that, in their eyes, was unforgivable. He tried to speak, to remind them what he was, what he was not. But each sentence fell like a stone in water, vanishing without a ripple. The judges did not listen. They waited, not for truth, for permission to proceed. The trial was never meant to reveal, only to confirm. He was not being judged. He was being processed, a ritual polished and rehearsed. To dress cruelty in robes and call it justice, he looked up only once, not to plead, but to mark the faces. Not out of fear, but memory. The same kind of memory that holds a flame even after the hand is burned. He wanted them to be remembered, not as arbiters, but as participants. Because silence is not neutrality. And a gavel, once struck, cannot be unsounded. When they read the sentence, the hall remained still. There was no gasp, no outrage, only the calm rhythm of authority enacting what it always planned to. His fate was sealed not with steel, but with ink, and the silence that followed felt more violent than any weapon. When it was over, they called it justice, but justice does not require dismemberment. Justice does not drip from hooks. They removed his head with a blade still warm from the smoke of his insides. The executioner did not flinch. This was not rage. It was ritual. Muscle from spine, jaw torn open like a broken hinge. The head, pale and blood-wet, was placed in a basket lined with straw. As if it were cargo, they took it to London Bridge. There, above the Thames, among soot and wind and the indifferent glide of gulls, they mounted it on a spike. A face made, for memory, turned into warning. The jaw slackened with rot, the eyes shriveled by sun. It hung above the river like a curse, watching the city that had consumed him. But they were not finished. His limbs were treated as messages. North, south, east, and west. Cut at the joints, drained, wrapped in rough cloth, then sent, like royal letters, to corners of a land he no longer belonged to. One to Newcastle, one to Perth, one to Stirling, one to Berwick. Each nailed. High on gates and towers, where wind could strip the meat slow and children could grow up pointing at the bones. It was meant to erase him, to scatter him, to unmake the name that had traveled too far for comfort. But names are not buried in flesh. The crows came. The stories grew. The nails rusted, and still the pieces did not quiet what they feared, because cruelty, when pushed past, reason does not extinguish. It preserves, and what they tried to silence still walked, still burned, still whispered, in every man who looked up at the bridge and did not turn away. There are fires that warm, and there are fires that flatten. His name burns now, but not in the way it once did. It is carved onto souvenirs, shouted over festival drums, stitched onto banners that flap in windless towns. A name that once made kings tremble is now sold beside mugs and replica swords. There is a mask where a man once stood. A voice dubbed in glory, stripped of pain, they call it legend. But legend does not feel the blade enter its stomach. It does. Not mourn in silence over the rope that crushed its wife's throat. It does not freeze to death in chains, or wait in a pit to be drawn, quartered, paraded. The man did. The man who walked with cracked heels and kept memories buried behind clenched teeth. The man who would not kneel, not for gold, not for favor, not even for survival. The man who stood, not with the nobility, but apart, who died alone because he believed some things should never be bent. But we remember him now as a hero in war paint, screaming on horseback, lit by fire that flatters rather than exposes. The real fire, the kind that consumes, is too ugly, too slow, too quiet for theaters. We remember his courage, not his isolation. We celebrate his defiance, but not the cost in it, not the hunger, not the betrayal, not the way the world turned its face as he was dragged like an animal through a city that no longer heard his name, only the echo of what they wanted it to mean. The myth is easier. The myth doesn't bleed. It doesn't beg. It doesn't rot. Forgets that Wallace wasn't trying to be remembered. He was trying to be heard. And when they silenced him, they made sure that what came after would be louder than his truth. Louder, but hollower. He became a product. But the man was quieter than we remember. Harder, stranger, more human, and far more alone. Not a rebel king. Not a god of war. Just someone who loved, lost, and refused to forget the sound of her voice. Someone who carried her memory into death because it was the only thing they hadn't taken. And when you say his name now, loudly, proudly, in stories that wear him like armor, ask yourself, are you remembering the man? Or just wearing the myth? He is not in the statues. Stone cannot hold grief. Bronze does not carry the heat of betrayal. There is no monument that remembers the weight of rope on living flesh, or the sound a body makes when its name is torn from it. He is not in the anthem, not in the film, not in the reenacted charge or painted face or carefully choreographed glory. Those things are too clean, too proud, too permanent. Wallace never wanted permanence. He wanted resistance, even if it meant exile, even if it ended in fire. You find him now in the places history forgets to look, in the pause before obedience, in the voice that says no, even when it knows the price. He lives in the cracks, between law and justice, between silence and what breaks it. He lives in the uneasy moment when a man realizes that what is legal is not always what is right, in the breath before rebellion, in the stillness that precedes courage. He was not made for rule. He was not designed for legacy. He did not ask for martyrdom. He was born to disrupt, to stand in the place where fear makes others sit, to speak when the powerful expect silence, to carry a wound deeper than any blade. The wound of knowing the truth is never convenient, and conscience is rarely rewarded. He does not haunt castles or battlefields. He haunts decision, choice, the human heart as it trembles between comfort and conviction. And in that trembling, he waits, not to be worshipped, but to be remembered. Correctly, not as a myth, as a mirror.